This Real Agriculture podcast is brought to you by Genesis Fertilizers. Nitrogen fertilizer is your farm's #1 expense. Farmers are working together through Genesis Fertilizers to solve the problem of high prices and security of supply by planning a state-of-the-art nitrogen plant. Security and earnings through ownership is the solution. Visit Genesis today at genesisfertilizers.com to learn more.
Real Agriculture presents Frontlines, geopolitics affecting agriculture with Jacob Shapiro of Cognitive Investments and Real Agriculture's Sean Hanney. It's time for another episode of the Frontlines podcast with myself, Sean Hanney, and joined, as always, by Jacob Shapiro of Cognitive Investments. Jacob, how are you doing today?
I'm good. Happy 2024, Sean. Let's get down to it.
Okay, now let's dig in. We're going to focus on a number of different topics here today. Up first, we've got what's happening in the Red Sea. We're seeing shipping rates increasing. We're seeing, obviously, a lot of disruption to some of the global economy. What do we make of this situation that has really kind of escalated over the past couple weeks?
It has. So, I mean, this is sort of a byproduct of the October 7th Hamas attacks against Israel. And you haven't seen any national actors quite yet been willing to throw their hat in the ring to support Hamas, but you have the Houthis, who are this Iranian-backed element that are in most parts of Yemen, who have taken to firing missiles and rockets and drones and things like that at the ships that are trying to go through the Red Sea. And the United States, with a coalition of powers, finally responded last week, struck some sites on the ground in Yemen, and it has not deterred them. So since the United States and the UK in particular, and then some support from some other states, since they attacked those Houthi elements, they apparently did not knock out their capacities to continue attacking ships in the Red Sea, because there have been attempted attacks already this week. There have also been sort of reports in just the last 24, 36 hours that the IRGC, so the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in Iran, has dispatched some of its troops or some of its people into Yemen to support the Houthis as well. So, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. But at the end of the day, the thing that you need to know is that shipping in the Red Sea is coming to a grinding halt. Shipping companies aren't willing to go through there. Insurance companies don't want to insure them going through there. And with crude sitting at 71, 72 a barrel, why not just take the longer route around Africa? So you add a couple days onto your trip. But if oil is going to stay this low and the Red Sea is going to stay this hot, probably the Red Sea is going to be closed for a period of weeks or months, especially if it looks like the United States can't get control of the situation, which is what it is starting to look like right now.
What is motivating the Houthis? Why are they doing this?
They are one of Iran's proxies. So they're in the same sort of weird camp as Hezbollah and Hamas, all of which are very, very, when I say strange, these are very, very different groups with different religious affiliations, with different ideologies, with different interests. But the one thing that links them is that they are Iranian proxies. And the Houthis are the one sort of element in the region that has not been willing to tolerate what Israel is doing in the Gaza Strip quietly. So they say that they are, trying to, express their support for Gazans and Palestinians, and specifically Hamas, by attacking these elements. And the goal here is, obviously, they're not striking at Israel per se, but they're striking at the reputation of the United States. The United States is supposed to be the guarantor of, freedom of navigation in the open seas. And so if you start going after, these ships and things like that, and you start taking resources away from supporting Israel to having to divert to attacking the Houthis, that's part of the logic here. But I take your question as a good one, because if this is the most of the, if this is the maximum fallout, regional fallout that we get from the Israel-Gaza war, it's not going to be that big of a deal, because the Houthis are a very, very small element, and they will probably be subdued one way or another. So you can take it two ways. You can take it as oh my God, Red Sea shipping has become extremely unsafe, and that's why we're going to see higher shipping rates, and maybe this is more inflation and things like that. The flip side of this is people were talking about World War III in the Middle East 2 months ago. Not me. We were talking about it more soberly on the podcast, but that was the general narrative out there. And the Houthis firing some drones and rockets at some ships, and the United States heading them back, that's not World War III. That's basically the same sort of thing that's been happening for 30 years.
From the U.S. perspective, how did they react to the fact that this hasn't deterred the Houthis? Is it something that they just sort of let slip and go quietly, or is there could we see some sort of escalation from the U.S. side at this point based on the lack of reaction from the Houthis?
I've been surprised at the weakness of the American response. It took them weeks to actually organize attacks against the Houthis themselves. And then the fact that you haven't been able to deter them, that's not a very good sign either. We have precedent for this. The United States did this in 2016. It did it in 1988 and actually struck Iranian targets back then too when shipping in the Red Sea was threatened. It wasn't the Houthis at that point, but the Middle East is sort of, the names change, but the game is always the same. So if you want to give the charitable interpretation, the Biden administration doesn't want to do this on its own. It's trying to build a coalition of allies and trying to do this in concert with those other allies. But the flip side of that is the United States kind of looks weak. And I don't understand it in part because while polling data in the U.S. suggests that there is that there's significant level of disagreement and dissatisfaction with how the Biden administration has supported Israel in its war in the Gaza Strip, most people or a majority of Americans are totally fine with the United States firing on targets in Yemen to open up Red Sea shipping. So Bernie Sanders might go on the floor of the Senate and rail about the Yemen issue again, but that's the maximum of what you're going to get. So it's been a little confusing to me why the Biden administration is trigger shy here.
Is the fact it's Iran on the other side and fear of escalation? Is that a consideration here?
That sort of underscores the point, though. If the United States is afraid of the Iranian response, then you really are in a much weaker position than you were even 4 or 5 years ago, because Iran also doesn't have that many conventional capabilities to bring to bear. They have not demonstrated that they want this conflict to escalate, even though it's their proxy that is getting its butt whooped by the Israelis right now. Not to mention, Iran is trying, they want the sea lanes open themselves. They're trying to export oil to China and anybody else who will buy their oil and things like that. They need the money themselves. So maybe the United States is afraid of Iran or afraid of some kind of regional escalation. But if you're afraid of that, we're already in a very, very different world than we were even 6-7 years ago in terms of American power.
It's a whole different problem or issue or challenge or whatever you want to phrase that. On the weekend, we had an election in Taiwan, and it did not go exactly the way that President Xi of China maybe would have wanted. Is that the way to view the result?
That's been the headline. And I think so often when it comes to China and Taiwan, the Western media and the English-speaking press in general gets it wrong. And I think they've gotten it wrong here too. Okay. So the first thing is that, yes, so it looks like the polls were accurate. So the DPP won another election. DPP, it's a little too strong to say they're pro-Taiwanese independence, but they're definitely anti-China. They want more self-reliance for Taiwan in general. So that, of course, is not what Xi Jinping wants. Xi Jinping would want somebody who's ready to reunify with the mainland. That's not going to happen, maybe even in our lifetimes. But the DPP lost its legislative majority. And if you look at the vote share between this election and the last election, it lost a substantial amount of support even in the vote for the presidency itself. And you had the KMT, which is sort of the party that is aligned more with China, pick up some votes. And then you also had the emergence of a third party for really the first time in Taiwanese politics, the TPP. And the TPP it's sort of hard to place them. The person who ran on their ticket in the past, he had supported DPP policies, but you could see him starting to pivot and try to be a little more pragmatic with China on the campaign trail as well. All of this, so it's not perfect. Like what Xi Jinping wants is for a pro-Chinese leader to get elected in Taiwan and Taiwan to elect to join the mainland, and they'll all sing whatever the Chinese equivalent is of Kumbaya and say, great, China's reunified. That's a pipe dream. That's not going to happen. But what he's had happen here is even if he has a DPP president who is not going to be friendly towards Beijing's interests, he has Taiwan's legislature now divided, and he now has a third political party on the scene. So this means that suddenly the more parties you stack in a democracy, the more pawns you have to play in the game of influence in general. So now the board looks a little bit different. And if you can't get reunification, the next best thing is paralysis or, trying to get these different sides squabbling with each other while the rest of the world doesn't notice all of the economic things and the incentive-laden things that China's doing to try and bring Taiwan closer into the fold. So the really sort of the one sentence punch away from that is to say, I think the English language press is focusing way too much on the potential for military conflict between China and Taiwan. And is this the result that China wanted? And should be focusing on what is the long-term trajectory of this? If we continue on this path, if Taiwanese politics continues to fracture like this for 10 or 15 years, 20 years, What does that look like? What does the lesson of Hong Kong tell us for that? What is the will of the United States and Japan and these other countries to support Taiwan if we get to that sort of place? And that's not in the conversation. The conversation is, oh, Xi Jinping didn't get what he wanted. I think that's a little simplistic.
Have you seen any data or polling results in terms of where the Western world sits on this issue between China and keeping Taiwan independence?
It's been a few months, so I'd have to update myself. But my guess on what it would be and my past experience would tell me that rhetorically, people would support Taiwan being independent. But the moment you start throwing around, okay, and would you support the deployment of Canadian troops or U.S. troops to the defense of Taiwan, the polling rates fall off a cliff. And that's, that would have been true before in a world where the Russia-Ukraine war is happening, where Israel-Gaza is happening, where all these other sorts of conflicts are happening. I think that would probably be what you would say. So I can check the polls and get back to you last time, but that's my hunch that rhetorically people like to talk about it, but when push comes to shove, people would probably not support it. And even if they do support it, if you got into a military conflict, how long would that hold? The Ukrainians are learning right now that Western political opinion is fickle and that eventually you will start losing that support in democracies because they want to focus on issues closer to home. Whereas for a country like China, Taiwan is the issue at home. It's been the biggest foreign policy issue for the People's Republic since it was founded and will be for another 100 years if they're fortunate enough to be around for another 100 years.
Yeah. And the fact that we have the war in Ukraine, what's happening in Israel, that's not helping the feelings or the support or lack thereof when it comes to the keeping Taiwan independent. It's really when there's just numerous cases of this right now, and so people are just going in a ton of different directions and quite distracted.
Yeah, and maybe I'm guilty of wanting issues to be too black and white, but for me, the real historical analogy that worries me is the Korean War. And the reason it worries me is because South Korea at the time, the United States had an ambiguous defense relationship with. On the one hand, they said they were supporting South Korea. On the other hand, you had Secretary of State Dean Acheson at the time gave a speech which seemed to imply that South Korea was outside of the U.S. security umbrella. And President Truman at the time said he wasn't going to commit U.S. troops to defending South Korea. And then it happens. North Korea invades South Korea, embarrasses them, almost conquers it. And the United States starts getting worried about Mao taking over Taiwan and the Soviet Union and the Cold War. And so suddenly the United States goes, oh no, we're going to defend this. We're going to go in. And I see the same sort of problem with Taiwan. You can see this just in the fact that the United States doesn't even recognize Taiwan as a country. It's putting pressure on the other small nations. I think there's 10 of them or 11 of them left that still recognize Taiwan. They want those countries to still recognize Taiwan, but the United States is not even willing to recognize Taiwan as an independent country. And yet when Joe Biden is asked, would the United States defend Taiwan if it were attacked by China? He gives a yes answer, which then pisses off the Chinese and we get back into diplomatic speak. So I don't like that ambiguity. I think you can make a very clear argument for, yes, draw a line in the sand at Taiwan, defend Taiwanese independence, arm them to the teeth, commit, draw that red line as a form of deterrence against China. I can also see the opposite argument. I can see the argument that says this is far away. It matters way more to China than anybody else. It's a waste of blood and treasure to try and defend this. It would be much easier to do a perimeter with the Philippines, Japan, and the other things. The position that doesn't make sense to me is, well, we recognize them, but we don't. And they're independent, but they're not. And we'll sort of defend them, but we really like that sense of ambiguity is what scares me because eventually China will do something to try to reunify. And if we're in ambiguous land at that point, whatever our response is, they'll probably win.
Yeah. No time for fence riding. Okay. The other one that I have, and I really like when you expose where it's like, yeah, I think the Western media is talking this and it's zig and zagging, right? Is and I've been trying to get my head wrapped around the election in Argentina. When the election happened, there was a lot of media that said, hey, this is the Trump of Argentina. And that seemed kind of lazy. How is it going? Because it seems like there's been a couple of examples where he really isn't, maybe what people thought he was, but he has had some early struggles, it seems. What's your evaluation?
Well, the first thing about Javier Milei, this new president, is that, I mean, he is insane. If you just look at his his history, I mean, the jokes sort of make themselves. This is a guy whose dead dog he said he channeled with and gave him the strategy that he needed to win the presidency. So that's the sort of personality that we're dealing with. But if you look at what he's tried to do in the first couple of months, if he is channeling his dead dog, the dog has it exactly right and is doing things very strategically and has a very, very good plan. He's unveiled this huge omnibus bill that tries to reform Argentina in all the ways that Milei thinks Argentina needs to be reformed. He's devalued the peso. He's promised to cut subsidies. He's eliminating all sorts of government ministries and things like that. There's a dark side to it too. He wants basically to be given the ability to rule by decree for 2 years. So that's, code for I'd like to be a dictator for 2 years. And the reason he wants that is because even though he won the presidency, he has very, very little support in Argentina's legislature, let alone in sort of all these constituencies and bureaucracies and labor unions that he wants to break up in the first place. So it's going to be very, very difficult for him to do everything that he says he's going to do. But the first thing to note is he didn't come in and, dollarize the economy immediately, as people were afraid of. He didn't come in and do anything that was particularly crazy. He came in and is talking and trying to do the exact things that, folks with that economic ideology have been talking about Argentina doing for decades, right up into, getting rid of export controls on things like beef and all of these agricultural commodities that Argentina grows in great abundance, but which previous Argentine governments, including the administration that preceded his, the Fernandez government, restricted Argentina from trading because food prices were going up and they wanted to try and keep food prices down for Argentinians themselves. So it's going to be a long road. And if this is the bottom for Argentina, I mean, we're talking 10, 20 years before it emerges. Think of the analogy here is Brazil. Brazil was a basket case in the early 90s, hyperinflation, sort of very, very similar. And it took about 20 years from when Brazil decided, okay, we're going to take the medicine and we're going to reform, to now look at where Brazil is today. Argentina could be on that trajectory, but even if it is, we're sort of talking that 10, 15-year horizon. And the question, I think, for us, I mean, historians will decide it in the future, but the question for us now is, well, is Milei that guy? Is he going to create change, or is he just sort of a loud personality that rode to the presidency on the discontent of the people, but the system itself is still too aligned against him that it won't be broken? And it would take a much bigger electoral victory, not just in the presidency, but in the legislature itself, for him to do the things that he's trying to do. But as somebody who has made fun of him, I think justly so, for his idiosyncrasies, his actual things, the policies he's actually talking about, there's nothing crazy about them. They make a ton of sense.
Right. They seem pragmatic, but they're also, I've seen articles where people are like, because now people, his constituents are upset about some of the things that he is doing because, change is hard, I think. So there's some pushback there. And you said his lack of popularity in some respects, it could be a challenge here for him to maybe get the time that is needed, maybe.
It's going to be very difficult for him, not least because what he's talking about is significant short-term pain in order to improve in the long run. It's not like the dog figured out anything that everybody else didn't know. We know exactly what medicine Argentina needs. You've just got 100 years of inertia and a previous system preventing people from applying the medicine. And the reason it prevents them from applying the medicine is because as soon as you apply it, you're going to get kicked out of office. Because nobody's going to elect you sort of on that basis if you start slashing subsidies and making things more expensive, which is what is going to happen in the short term. So that really comes down to whether Argentinians, whether it was just a one-time protest vote, they were just fed up with the candidates and they wanted something different, which would be sort of the Trump-esque phenomenon, or whether there really is this realization, this inflection point happening in Argentinian culture where they're saying, this can't go on. Like, our children and our grandchildren are not going to have a future if we keep governing this way. We really have to make a change. And that's an open question. I think it's a little early to say that's happened. Like I said, I'd like to see whether he could force through some of these policies, whether he can build enough political alliances to get some of these reforms through. That's the next litmus test. If he starts doing that, if he starts getting enough center-right buy-in and starts actually being able to push through some of the policies that he's talking about, then we might have a really interesting story about Argentina emerging, not just as a strong economic power in South America, but as a competitor for U.S. farmers and Canadian farmers and all sorts of farmers around the world. Because if Argentina ever figured itself out, I mean, it's just like Brazil, if not even more of a competitor.
Yeah, which that from a competitive standpoint, like you said, it'd be a big concern for all the countries like Canada and the U.S. that are, trying to gain export markets, and specifically from a China perspective. What
Mhm.
is the tie between Argentina and China? How does China view Argentina?
Well, this will be another really interesting test of Milei's pragmatism because he really railed against China on the campaign trail. And in the past, previous Argentine governments have wanted better relations with China. They see China as a balance against the United States. They see China as a potential export market. As president, Milei has softened his language a bit. You can tell that he realizes, oh, like it's not going to be so good for me if I can't sort of sell into the Chinese market. The other thing for China is, China has very few levers to push back against the United States from a tactical geopolitical perspective. By that I mean the United States supports Taiwan. It has defense treaties with South Korea and with Japan and with the Philippines and with Australia, and it's trying to build a deeper relationship with India. The United States has a lot of pieces on the board that it can move around in China's near abroad. China doesn't really have that against the United States or Canada in the Western Hemisphere. And one of the things China has been opportunistically trying to do is build better relations with some of these countries. So we've seen it a little bit with Venezuela. You've seen a little bit with Cuba. And it's also been, from an economic standpoint, it has been deepening relations with Brazil and with Argentina, getting more imports and all those other sorts of things. So I think that's how China sees Argentina. And it's sort of the flip side of things. A lot of these countries in Asia are willing to make deals with the United States or be allied with the United States because the United States is a long way away. They know that the United States is sort of the less threatening power to them than China, which is much closer and has other, interests. The same is true for a country in South America. The United States is much closer. You've got hundreds of years of the United States treating this like their own backyard, whereas China is very far away. They might want to buy things from you. They might be able to push on certain political influence buttons, but ultimately they're not going to, they're not going to send the Chinese Navy into the region to block your trade, or they're not going to engineer coups in countries in your backyard, which is what the United States was doing. So it's sort of the flip side of the United States support of countries in Asia.
Fascinating. What kind of year do you think we have in front of us in 2024 when it comes to the geopolitical scene? It seems like it's been a wild ride the past 2 years, no doubt about it. What do you think's in store for us in 24?
It's always a wild ride, and it was a busy end of the year last year, so I'm only just sort of doing my 24 forecasting process now. But I think the one thing I'm pretty sure about, and which we're sort of developing at the firm, is the U.S. presidential election is the most important geopolitical issue in the world, full stop. And I always joke when I give presentations at different conferences and things like that. I always love my job because I usually don't have to talk about the United States. I can usually focus on the rest of the world. The United States, whatever, nothing much changes. But it's a real dumpster fire in the United States. And there are very real differences between what happens if Biden wins again or if a Democrat wins versus whether it's Trump or it's some other sort of scenario. If Trump were to win, that's going to the chain reaction of how that's going to affect U.S.-China relations, how that's going to affect the Russia-Ukraine war, how that's going to affect U.S. relations with its allies, whether that's the European Union or Canada. I mean, it opens up a whole can of worms there. So I think the thing to be watching, I think most of the world will be sort of in a holding pattern about this is, what is going to happen in the United States? And are we going to be dealing with the United States that we did for the last 3-4 years with Biden at the helm and trying to return to pragmatism? Or are we going to go back to that 2016 to 2020 Make America Great thing again? And that would be a cause of significant instability and volatility. So I don't have the answer. If I knew the answer to that question, I wouldn't be talking to you. I'd be on a little island somewhere in the South Pacific, counting my dollars. But I think that's the question that we need to be focused on.
Well, we'll be here with you every step of the ride. So, hey, Jacob, thanks so much for joining me for another episode of Frontlines podcast.
Great to be with you, Sean. Talk to you soon.